in the winter of 1940 in a walled compound outside Harbin called Pingfang. A Japanese army surgeon named Shiro Ishii stood before rows of glass specimen jars and told his staff that what they did there was patriotic research, not murder. This was Unit 731, the biological warfare complex Ishii had spent nearly a decade building for the Imperial Japanese Army in occupied Manchuria, and by then thousands of prisoners had already died inside its walls. How does a trained physician sworn by tradition to heal talk himself and hundreds of colleagues into believing that killing men, women, and children in the name of science is not only permissible but necessary? That question is the spine of this story, and Ishii is only the first man we need to understand to answer it. Ishii was not a fanatic in the theatrical sense. He was, by every surviving account, a charmer, gregarious, ambitious, fond of parties, endlessly persuasive with the generals who controlled his budget. He had trained as a bacteriologist at Kyoto Imperial University, and he genuinely believed Japan was behind the great powers in biological science. What made him dangerous wasn't ideology so much as appetite for rank, for funding, for the prestige of running something no one else in the army could run. In 1932, he convinced the War Ministry to let him build an epidemic prevention research station, a bureaucratic euphemism that let the program hide in plain sight. Over the following decade, that station grew into a small city of laboratories, complete with its own airfield, prison blocks, and crematorium. And Ishii ran it less like a barracks than like a university department with unlimited grant money and no ethics board. That institutional camouflage was the first sign of who Ishii really was. He recruited actively from Japan's top medical schools, dangling academic promotions and post-war professorships to young doctors who might otherwise have found the work unthinkable. Colleagues later testified that Ishii kept meticulous records, frostbite experiments that tracked how long it took limbs to blacken, plague-infected fleas bred by the millions, vivisections performed on conscious prisoners because anesthesia in his reasoning would corrupt the physiological data. The prisoners were never called prisoners in the paperwork. They were Maruta logs, a term so casually used that survivors of the unit's medical staff recalled it decades later without apparent discomfort. Ishii didn't invent cruelty, he industrialized it, and he did it with the polish of a man convinced he was advancing civilization. By the early 1940s, that industrial cruelty went operational. Unit 731 dropped plague-infested fleas over Chinese cities and contaminated wells and food supplies in field tests that killed an estimated tens of thousands of civilians. A death toll historians are still trying to pin down because so many records were destroyed. And it's here that Ishii's story takes its most morally corrosive turn, not in the killing itself, but in what happened after Japan surrendered. When American occupation authorities arrived in 1945, they knew almost immediately what Unit 731 had done. Rather than prosecute Ishii and his senior staff at the war crimes tribunals in Tokyo, U.S. investigators, working largely through the office of General Douglas MacArthur, negotiated a secret deal, immunity from prosecution, in exchange for the unit's research data on biological weapons. The Soviets, who had captured some lower-ranking officers, tried a dozen of them at Khabarovsk in 1949 and publicized the horror to the world, but Ishii himself was shielded by the very government that had just fought a war to end atrocities like his. He returned to Japan, lived quietly, and died of throat cancer in 1959, having never faced a courtroom or offered a public accounting of what happened at Pingfang. Many of his subordinates went on to distinguished post-war careers in medicine and pharmaceuticals. One of the men connected to the unit later helped found what became a major Japanese blood products company. The full documentary record didn't surface publicly until the 1980s, when Japanese journalists and American historians such as Sheldon Harris began prying open archives that governments on both sides had preferred sealed. Ishii's evil in the end wasn't only that he built a death factory disguised as science, it's that the world found his data more useful than his victims' justice. This is the shape the central promise of this film keeps returning to. Evil scientists in history rarely look like monsters at the moment they act. They look like competent men serving an institution, and the institution decides afterward how much of that competence is worth protecting. If Ishii represents evil dressed as institution building, the next man on this list represents something colder and more intimate. Evil performed one selection at a time on a train platform by a doctor who was, by multiple survivor accounts, unnervingly charming. Josef Mengele arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau in the spring of 1943, a Waffen SS captain with a medical degree and a doctorate in anthropology, and within weeks he had made himself indispensable, not because he was ordered to do the worst work, but because he volunteered for it with visible enthusiasm. Survivors remember him standing on the arrival ramp in a pressed uniform, sometimes whistling opera, sorting new prisoners left and right with a flick of his riding crop, left to slave labor, right to the gas chambers, deciding the fate of hundreds of thousands of people with what witnesses described as bureaucratic calm. What made Mengele different from an ordinary camp functionary was his academic ambition. Before the war, he had studied under Ottmar von Verschuer, a prominent geneticist who directed research on heredity at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology in Berlin, one of Germany's most respected scientific institutions, not some fringe outfit. Verschuer was fascinated by twin studies as a way to untangle nature from environment, and Mengele saw Auschwitz as an unrepeatable research opportunity, a captive population containing twins, dwarfs, people with mismatched eye colors, entire families he could study and then kill without consequence. He pulled twins from the transports for his own experiments, injecting chemicals into their eyes to try to change iris color, infecting one twin with disease to compare the reaction against the healthy sibling, performing organ removals without anesthesia, and shipped specimens, including preserved eyes and organs, back to Verschuer's Institute in Berlin for analysis. This was not a rogue doctor operating outside the scientific establishment. It was a scientific establishment reaching directly into a death camp for material it wanted. Survivors who encountered Mengele repeatedly described the same disorienting contradiction. A man who could be gentle with the children he was studying, bringing them sweets, learning their names, and then coolly send their parents to the gas chamber the same afternoon. That contradiction is not a footnote to his story. It is the story evil. In Mengele's case, didn't look like a monster. It looked like a mentor with excellent bedside manner who happened to also be a killer. And that duality is precisely why his name became shorthand for medical atrocity in post-war memory, because it was documented so extensively by so many witnesses who lived to describe it, including the writer Elie Wiesel, who encountered Mengele on the platform as a teenager. When Auschwitz's liberation drew near in January 1945, Mengele didn't wait to be captured. He shed his SS uniform, secured false papers, and simply walked out of the historical record for a while, working briefly as a farmhand under an assumed name in Bavaria before slipping through the post-war chaos entirely. In 1949, with help from Nazi escape networks and notably financial support from his own family's successful agricultural machinery business back in Günzburg, he sailed to Argentina and lived under his own name for years, protected by sympathetic expatriate communities and for a time apparently by connections reaching into the Argentine government itself. Protected CTA Sentence 01 Nazi hunters, most famously Simon Wiesenthal and later Israeli intelligence, chased leads across South America for decades and repeatedly missed him by months or miles as he moved from Argentina to Paraguay to Brazil. He died in 1979. Drowning after a stroke while swimming off a Brazilian beach under a false name, undetected. It wasn't until 1985 that investigators located his grave, and not until 1992 that DNA testing definitively confirmed the remains were his. He had escaped every court on earth. His reputation as the angel of death was sealed instead in the memories of the people who survived him, which turned out to be a harsher and more permanent verdict than any tribunal could have delivered. Verschuer, meanwhile, was never seriously prosecuted either. He simply resumed a respectable academic career in West Germany as a professor of human genetics until his death in 1969. A reminder that Mengele's individual monstrousness grew out of soil that a whole respected institution had tilled. Now step back from the death camps and the biological weapons compounds, because not every scientist on this list needs a uniform to do damage. Some do it in a laboratory coat, convinced they are serving civilization, and pay for it with their own families before the world ever calls them villains. Fritz Haber is the hardest case here precisely because half of his legacy is genuinely heroic. In 1909, working with the engineer Karl Bosch at the chemical company BASF, Haber solved one of the great problems of industrial chemistry: how to pull nitrogen out of thin air and turn it into ammonia, the basis of synthetic fertilizer before that process. Now called the Haber-Bosch process, humanity's food supply was limited by natural nitrogen sources like guano and mined nitrates. Haber's chemistry, scaled up by Bosch into an industrial process, is credited with helping feed a global population that has since grown several times over. Some historians estimate that close to half of the nitrogen in the proteins in your body today traces back to that reaction. It is, by any measure, one of the most consequential inventions in the history of applied science. It also won Haber the Nobel Prize. But Haber's personality is the hinge on which this story turns dark, and it has everything to do with insecurity. He was born into an assimilated Jewish family in Breslau, converted to Christianity as a young man, and spent much of his career desperate to prove himself not just a great German scientist, but an unimpeachably loyal one, more patriotic, if anything, than his Gentile colleagues, because he felt he had more to prove. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Haber threw himself into military service with a zeal that alarmed even some of his own colleagues. He personally lobbied the German High Command to deploy chlorine gas as a weapon, arguing it could break the stalemate of trench warfare and shorten the war. On April 22, 1915, at Ypres, German troops released roughly 168 tons of chlorine gas along a 4-mile front, the first large-scale chemical attack in modern warfare, and Haber was there in person. In an officer's uniform he had no formal right to wear as a civilian scientist, personally supervising the release of the canisters. His wife, Clara Immerwahr, gives this story its most devastating human counterweight. Clara was not a bystander. She was a scientist in her own right, the first woman to earn a doctorate in chemistry at the University of Breslau in 1900, at a time when German universities barely tolerated women in lecture halls at all. She had given up much of her own career to support Haber's, and by most surviving accounts she was horrified by what he was doing regarding the weaponization of chemistry as, in her words reported by contemporaries, a perversion of science and a betrayal of everything the discipline was supposed to be for. On the night of May 1, 1915, just days after the Ypres attack, following a dinner at their home in Berlin, celebrating Haber's promotion to captain, Clara took his service revolver into the garden and shot herself. She died the following morning. Haber, according to most historical accounts, left for the Eastern Front to oversee further gas operations against Russian forces within days of her death. A detail some biographers frame more cautiously given the incomplete documentation, but one that has shaped his reputation ever since as a man who let ambition and duty override even the most immediate grief. The war did not end the way Haber hoped it would, and the years that followed exposed just how conditional his usefulness to the German state really was. In 1919, the victorious Allied powers listed Haber among the individuals they wanted, tried for war crimes, for his role in gas warfare, and he briefly fled to Switzerland to avoid arrest before the demand quietly lapsed. That same year, the Nobel Committee announced he would receive the 1918 Chemistry Prize for the ammonia synthesis, a decision so controversial that French and British scientists boycotted the ceremony in protest, unwilling to sit in the same room as the architect of chemical warfare being honored as a benefactor of humanity. Haber never publicly expressed regret in the way his critics wanted. His defense, consistent throughout his later writing and correspondence, was that a scientist's discoveries belonged to peacetime uses just as much as wartime ones, and that a chemist serving his country in war was no different morally from a soldier serving with a rifle. That exemption expired for Haber in the cruelest way imaginable. He spent the 1920s rebuilding his reputation as director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry in Berlin, one of the most prestigious scientific posts in the country, and his laboratory's later work on pesticide gases would, after his departure, contribute to chemical research lines that eventually fed into the development of Zyklon B, the gas used in the very extermination camps where Mengele would later work, though Haber himself died before that connection was cemented and bore no direct role in the death camps. What he did live to see was the Nazi rise to power in 1933 and the racial laws that followed. Despite his conversion, his military service, his Nobel Prize, and decades of loyalty to the German state, Haber was Jewish by ancestry under Nazi law, and he was forced to resign his directorship and flee the country he had gassed enemy soldiers to defend. He died in exile in Basel, Switzerland in January 1934, a broken man by most accounts, having discovered too late that the nation he'd sacrificed his wife's peace and his own conscience for had never actually considered him one of its own. Put these three men side by side, and a pattern starts to emerge. That's more useful than simply cataloguing horror. None of them thought of themselves as villains. Ishii believed he was closing a scientific gap between Japan and the West. Mengele believed he was contributing to a grand project of human genetics that respected institutions in Berlin were already pursuing. Haber believed with real conviction that shortening a war through chemistry was an act of mercy dressed in an unpleasant uniform. Each of them found an institution willing to fund, shield, or launder that belief: the Imperial Japanese Army, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, the German High Command, because ambition and nationalism and the hunger for prestige rarely announced themselves as evil. They announced themselves as diligence, as patriotism, as the unglamorous grind of running a lab, writing a report, or standing at a podium, accepting an award nobody else in the room wants to applaud. Their afterlives diverged in ways that say as much about the world that judged them as about the men themselves. Ishii's evil was buried under a Cold War bargain and only clawed back into public memory through decades of investigative history. The country that shielded him did so not because it approved of what he'd done, but because it wanted his data more than it wanted justice. Mengele's evil became the most globally recognized of the three precisely because so many of his victims survived to testify, turning a single camp doctor into the archetypal face of medical atrocity, even though the institution that trained and directed his research, Verschuur's respected genetics program, mostly escaped that same scrutiny. Haber's case remains the most contested, a man honored with a Nobel Prize and, controversially, with an institute still bearing his name in Berlin today, precisely because his contribution to feeding the world is inseparable. In the historical ledger, from his contribution to gassing men in the trenches, and from the wife who took her own life rather than share in that legacy. So which of these three verdicts feels more troubling? The one buried by governments, the one delivered by survivors, or the one still argued over by historians? What connects them isn't a shared ideology or even a shared field. It's the specific, recurring shape of the self-justification. The belief that scientific curiosity, institutional duty, or national loyalty could suspend ordinary ethical limits, at least for a while, at least for people who'd been defined as outside the circle of concern. That belief didn't require a monster to hold it. It required a competent, ambitious, professionally embedded person who had convinced himself the exception applied to him, and more chillingly, it required universities, armies, corporations, and governments willing to fund the exception as long as the results kept coming. The most disturbing lesson these three lives leave behind isn't that science can be twisted by evil men. It's that evil historically has rarely needed to twist science very hard at all. It has usually just needed institutions willing to look away, and men clever enough to give them a reason to.